The UK now, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson looks likely to backflip on an earlier decision to allow Chinese tech giant Huawei to build Britain's new 5G network. Now, in a series of announcements over the past few days, the Conservative government will now conduct a review into the impact of allowing Huawei telco equipment to be used in Britain's 5G build, after a fairly significant backlash from members of Johnson's own party and concern from members of the Five Eyes Security Alliance, in particular, the United States.
Absolutely right to be concerned about investment, to be concerned about the buying up of UK technology now by countries that may not always may have ulterior motives, and we are certainly bringing forward measures to ensure that we protect our technological base.
Well, so are they in or out? Sir Iain Duncan Smith, a member of the House of Commons and former leader of the Conservative Party, was also in the Cameron government, one of the reformist ministers, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. In recent times, he served as chairman of Boris Johnson's winning leadership campaign following the departure of Theresa May. Iain Duncan Smith was knighted earlier this year for political and public service. He's been a strong critic of Huawei's involvement in Britain's telecommunications and security infrastructure. He joins me now from London. Well, we started this conversation a little while ago. There's been quite a lot of movement. I thought I'd come back to the source. Is a rethink a reversal here? I'm not entirely sure where this is headed. Can you enlighten us?
Well, good evening to you, morning to us. I'm pleased that the government has made this announcement. The Prime Minister has finally confirmed the reports, because what we've had is a real nightmare that Huawei, which already, by the way, through successive governments has been allowed to be in 3G and 4G, was about to be allowed to be in 5G. So there was a rebellion about that, and it's quite clear and obvious that now the government realises, first and foremost, they're not going to get any legislation through because there's such a move against this. But secondly, also, that we now need to chart a course ahead about how not just getting rid of Huawei, but how we in the free world, and this is the point that I want to go further on, we in the free world, including countries like Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, and others in Europe, recognise the deep threat that is now posed to us by our dependency on China. I was intrigued listening to the earlier interview about the state of Victoria getting deeper and deeper in with China on Belton Road. Belton Road has one purpose, as far as I can see, which is to make those who are party to it become very dependent on China. They're strategic at every single turn. It's time we looked at this carefully and decided that we cannot allow our most strategic areas to be locked into China.
It's interesting here in Australia over the weekend, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has made some very pointed comments about the Victorian state government's deal with China. Now, telecommunications policy isn't in the remit of state governments, it's in the remit of national governments. And nonetheless, he made it clear if he had to, he'd basically disconnect Australia from any significant communications networks because of the worry they have over the Victorian deal. Now, I'd be interested to know, what do you think was the tipping point with your Prime Minister on moving away from Huawei here? Was it pressure from the United States? Was it from colleagues like you with plenty of standing? Or perhaps did he not understand the ramifications of that early decision? And how confident are you that this really will mean that Britain will not proceed with Huawei? Because you can have a review, and you can have a review that doesn't do much, or you can have a review that changes the game. Will it change the game?
Well, my view about the review, and I've made this clear directly to the Prime Minister, it's not a review about whether, it's a review about how. So the question really is, how do we get rid of them from these existing infrastructure and make very clear that any future is wound down so that it's gone, and the target date is 2022, 2023. So first and foremost, it's getting them out, because they pose a genuine, I think, and real threat. They're already seen by GCHQ, the intelligence center, as an untrusted vendor, which means it's kind of peculiar language for saying you can't trust these so-and-sos because, you know, they do all sorts of things which we think are dangerous to us. So it's ironic that we should even be thinking about having them in. Secondly, what made it happen? I think one was the rebellion. I think that was a shock to the government. 38 Conservatives and the party has a majority of 80 at the moment. 38 did not back the government on this, and there were many more who said, when the real legislation comes forward, they're certainly going to vote against it. So first and foremost, the old phrase of force majeure, when the numbers don't stack up for you in Parliament, you have to do a rethink. The second part of that is not just on a rethink, but it's also to do with the fact that it's becoming clear and obvious since COVID, slowly, bit by bit, rather like peeling back the orange peel, as it were, getting to the heart of the orange. What you see now is the dominance that China has involved itself in almost every single sphere of our lives. You know, we're busy having nuclear power stations set up. And the third one that they're talking about will actually literally be wholly run by the Chinese. So that there are real questions about where we're going. And I think this is a question for the West, for the free world, for those who really cherish liberties, human rights, the rule of law, a world trading system that obeys laws and that in reality is there for others to use, knowing full well those rules protect the way that they trade. All of these are often abused by the Chinese, not to mention the intellectual property theft that's been taking on. And we have to work this out now. The government itself is a really, really difficult government. And right now we're watching the crackdown on Hong Kong, the breaking ultimately of the one system, two rules, as it were, one country, two systems rather. That is damaging indeed. So we're beginning to see something which is the real China come through. And I have to say it's not a pretty picture.
Of course, for us here in Australia, it's an enormous challenge, not just because of proximity and the security questions that rightly you have in Britain, but for us it's a certain very strong economic relationship as well, and we've seen the threats that Australia's faced. I want to ask you on the economic front, we've watched, almost 40,000 lives lost in Britain. You're headed to some pretty difficult economic challenges yourselves. How is things with Britain at the moment, and are you sort of feeling as though you're turning the corner, at least on the health aspects?
Well, things aren't great. Let's be honest about this. Rather like many other countries, we went into lockdown, and what actually happened was the private sector has had an absolute hammering. We've protected the real effects of this for some time by having policies that support people in work, even though they're furloughed, they're not working. We give them 80% of their salaries. Self-employed, a whole bunch of them are being supported during this period. But that isn't going to last forever, because the cost of this is billions upon billions. This last month's borrowing just showed us that we have now borrowed in 1 month more than we've ever borrowed ever. And that is only the beginning. So we now have to recognize that if we don't start unlocking this economy, there won't be an economy to unlock. So I've been arguing, amongst others, that we now have to get the balance in place, because a damaged economy will lead to further deaths, real problems, poor treatment, inability to invest in some of our public services, like the health service. So, people have been wrongly casting this as save the economy versus save lives. It's not, it's save lives. Without an economy, we can't do anything. And so we've got to get this economy moving and recognize there are ways to do it without destroying our abilities. And such as the social distancing, one of the big questions over here I posed is, why is the UK determined to have a 2-meter social distancing rule when no other country that I know of, certainly not in Europe and in the States, has a 2-meter rule? They have about 1.5. WHO
yeah, we've got 1.5. We've got 1.5.
And it makes a huge difference. Makes an
8 or 9 times
on
the
transport.
size. Yeah, 8 or 9 times the geography to play with. I've got to go, but just before we go, there's a lot of chat here. We're following the Dominic Cummings brouhaha pretty closely. Where do you stand on this? Should he go? There's calls for him to be sacked. Should he go?
Well, I go with the Prime Minister in the sense the Prime Minister has to make this decision. He's his advisor. He's clearly been close to him throughout and responsible for his election victory and everything else. And I think the Prime Minister decided that he didn't break the rules, didn't break the law, whatever else you think about his judgment. And he's decided that he will stay. And on that basis, I frankly want, like many others, to move on. I'm not professing any public opinion on this matter, because I think it's a matter for the government to deal with. The government has to decide what the basis is as we start to unlock now this week more announcements. The big focus, there are big issues, and I want to keep on those, such as Hong Kong and unlocking.